So our first session is with a very special guest who's been incredibly supportive of AviaDev since the day the idea was conceived back in 2015 during the Africa Hotel Investment Conference in Addis in 2015 in October. Now, I refer to him as the godfather of African aviation, partly because he's seen it all, but also due to the fact that he is revered and respected the world over for the contribution he has made to making African aviation a player on the global scene and building Ethiopian Airlines into the largest carrier in Africa. To provide some background, Mr. Wake began his career at Ethiopian Airlines back in 1965, served them for almost 30 years before making the move to Gulf Air in Bahrain, and then back to Ethiopian in 2004, where he took over as CEO. And it was in that period, with Girma at the helm, that saw Ethiopian grow at the astonishing rates we still see today. He then became chairman of RwandAir in 2012. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Girma to join me on stage, and we're going to have a little chat. Please welcome him to the stage. So, Girma, like being in the front room, this is fun. Let's start at the beginning. What was it that sparked your interest in aviation?
I was a student at the university, and one day, by accident, Ethiopian Airlines was recruiting pilots for Ethiopian Airlines. And some of my friends wanted to be pilots. For me, it was not that interesting, but I said, since my friends are going, let me accompany them to go to the airport. So I went there, and the man who was in the personnel department gave me the form and said, "You fill it." I said, "No, I'm not interested." He said, No, fill it, it's okay, you will never know. You will fly an airplane and then go back. I did. They accepted me, and there I remained. So it was not really intentional, it was by coincidence that I became an aviation man. And I think I don't regret it.
No, that's great. It's good to hear. It's always nice. We were at the university yesterday in Kigali. There was 10, 11 of us that went down and spoke with the students. Unfortunately, all the 200 students that were there yesterday, I can't obviously invite them to be here. So we thought we'd take the conference to them. And I asked all the speakers to say what it was that got them involved in aviation. And it's always something a little bit random, generally, and a sort of almost by accident. So tell me, if you weren't working in aviation, what would you have done?
I would have been a teacher.
You are a teacher.
And what happened is, even in the 40 plus years that I worked in the aviation, best 4 years and a half are the period I spent in the training department of Ethiopian Airlines as an instructor. That is a job that I loved, and that was the base for me, because when you try to teach something, you'd want to know better than your students. Therefore, you read a lot, you learn a lot. And that gradually builds your knowledge in the industry. And that's why I always wanted to be a teacher. And I got that in the airline also, so it was good.
Okay, so in the audience, put your hands up if you think you've learned something during your career from Ato Girma. See? Look, it's lots, you know? And that's probably on a very personal basis. And like I say, the support that you showed me when I was starting this up as a concept is fantastic. And you've been to both AviaDevs and obviously taking part today, which is great. So what about role models? Who was your role model growing up?
To be honest, in that area, I have no role model.
That's fine.
I enjoyed doing what I was doing, but I have not followed anybody.
That's absolutely fine. I mean, what I did, just to give you an idea, I use LinkedIn a lot, and I put on LinkedIn that I was going to be speaking with Girma, so I said, what would you like to ask? And I put it out, and we got lots of comments, so I've kind of amalgamated those questions from the industry. I wanted it to be personal, but also we obviously want to share some insight into the industry as well. So let's go back to your career now. So you've always worked for state-owned carriers, correct?
Not really.
But majority.
Most of the time, I worked for state-owned airlines, Ethiopian Airlines, Gulf Air. These are state-owned airlines. But I also worked for DHL for 2.5 years on a loan from Gulf Air. And I think I also enjoyed that.
And I imagine you had some great opportunities that you passed up. Are there any that you regret or any that you particularly remember?
In fact, it helped me working for DHL. I always worked in an organization where budget restricts everything, and ideas, no matter how much new things come up, you have to wait for a budget season in state airlines. But in DHL, when there is an opportunity, you jump on it. Budget is not a restriction, you just jump on it and do it. And when I came back to Gulf Air from DHL after 2.5 years, I had a completely different type of thinking. And to be honest with you, it helped me a lot when I came as a CEO in Ethiopian Airlines also. So working both in private and government actually prepares you better.
So you took a private sector approach to a public-owned enterprise.
And that is what it should be. If you want to run a state-run airline, the way the government runs its offices, you will never get anywhere. You have got to put that private business practice into an airline to be able to sustain an operation. So it is a good idea to have a mix of both. If you don't have anything of a state airline and you come to run a state airline, you will have a problem because you will not be able to push the bureaucracy. So having both sides, I think it prepares you better.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that brings us on nicely. You were most recently, you've been very heavily involved in RwandAir and served as chairman of the board of directors. And they're obviously themselves expanding at a rapid rate. Can you see RwandAir rivaling the other large African carriers in terms of size and scale and obviously profitability when it comes to Ethiopian specifically? What do you see the future?
RwandAir is a good airline. It has a very supportive and committed government. And the staff pride themselves of a quality of work. So it has the potential to really be a good airline. But there are things that they should do. They will have to commercialize the organization more than they do today. And I think once they establish a good network and also the financial discipline that is required to run a good airline, I think the potential of RwandAir to, not in the next 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, probably the next decade, they could be one of the good airlines in Africa.
But the nice thing, I suppose, is it's a long-term strategy. They're not expecting...
It has to be. Anybody who gets into an airline business to make money fast, he's in the wrong business. We have seen this time and again. An airline business, you should only enter if you have there for a long haul.
Yeah, and I think it was Richard Branson that said, if you want to make $1 million, then start with $1 billion and start an airline. It's the only way. So
he learned it when he started an airline in Nigeria.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish he was here. That would be good too. We could ask him.
By the way, before Richard Branson, when he was discussing to start an airline in Nigeria, we met in New York. And he told me, Girma, you know, I am starting an airline in Nigeria. I said, are you sure? He said, yes. I said, good luck. He said, why? I don't think you have done your homework properly. He said, what? I fly to Nigeria, I make more money as Virgin Atlantic in Nigeria. I know how to run Nigeria. I said, yes, you are operating there few flights a week, but you are going there as a businessman who makes some money and goes out. But when you become a base carrier, it's a different story. He said, no, I know how to treat it. I said, good luck. After 2 years, he called me one day and said, Sir Branson wants to talk to you. I said, Girma, you know, I want to sell Virgin Nigeria. Since you are an African and you understand Africa better, why don't you buy it? I'll sell it to you for $1. Okay, now you learn.
That's a great story. Fantastic. So let's talk about Ethiopian. Obviously, you spent a lot of time there at the helm, and as I said, you know, it experienced the growth, and RwandAir, your successor, has taken that obviously to the next level, and it's the standard bearer for African aviation. But it's really starting to develop now into a powerhouse airline. And it's been very clever strategically partnering and investing in other airlines across the continent, like Askai in Lome in Togo. But there's also talk of Zambia, DRC, and Chad, and helping those set up a national carrier. Do you think this would lead to a monopolization of the market, and is that good for Africa?
Africa is a very vast continent. It has 1.2 billion people. If Ethiopian Airlines opens and partners with carriers in Africa, at most it will be with 4 or 5 airlines. And these 4 or 5 airlines that may partner with Ethiopian Airlines will have the benefit of the training facilities of Ethiopian Airlines, management support of Ethiopian Airlines, the know-how, the marketing ideas, and more than everything else, the maintenance facility of Ethiopian Airlines. Most carriers in Africa don't have their own facility. So partnering with an airline that has these facilities will improve the total standard of African aviation. So the idea is good. In fact, I started it when I was in Ethiopian Airlines, when we established ASCAI with the financial institutions in West Africa. And I think it's a good thing to do. And by having 4 or 5 subsidiary airlines, you are not going to monopolize 55 countries. It's not going to be a monopoly. Okay. In fact, if I had my way, I would want South African to do the same thing, Kenya Airways to do the same thing, Egypt Air, Royal Air Morocco, everybody to start working with smaller African carriers so that they can all together bring up the standard of aviation in Africa. So it is a good thing, and it will not be a monopoly. Okay. It did not create monopoly in America. It did not create monopoly in Europe, and this is not going to be a monopoly in Africa. But it will improve the total standard of aviation in Africa, and therefore gradually enable African carriers to take the rightful share in the global market. Today, African carriers only uplift 20% of traffic coming into Africa, even in coming into its own continent. So I think we need to really build good, big airlines before we can really get to a place where we would want to be.
So fast forward, 10 years from now, we're sat here having this conversation. And what are we looking at? Are we looking at large carriers with their own subsidiaries? Or, what's it going to look like? What's the landscape going to look like in 10 years, in your opinion?
I think in 10 years, we'll see 4 or 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. We'll see 4 or 5 good African large carriers, 4 or 5, not more than that. It can even be less.
And profitable, or just
And
large?
profitable. And we'll also see small niche airlines connecting Africa together, because these big airlines are not really going to do a lot of connection. To compete with Emirates, Qatar, and the European carriers, they have to fly non-stop. But Africa has to be connected internally. And these niche carriers can connect and bring traffic to the main hubs so that the big carriers can take them from there. I think that will improve the scene in Africa.
And obviously the partnership we alluded to with ASKY,
Yes.
it posted a profit.
It does. And, more than the money that, for example, Ethiopian Airlines makes from holding investment in ASKY, the traffic that ASKY feeds into Ethiopian Airlines supports Ethiopian Airlines network. So it is good. And I believe other African carriers should do the same.
And it seems like there is a movement from the government's understanding that they need the expertise. There is this thing that we always talk about every African country needs a national carrier. It's the same as having a flag or a national anthem, etc. But it's more about, is the market there, and commercially, does it work, I guess? That's what we got to look at?
That's what we have got to look at. Africa would have to realize the African Union is pushing for one Africa, the United States of Africa. When that day comes, and I don't know when it comes, but when it comes, gradually it will come, there will be only one flag and small flags somewhere else. I think countries should not be looking for a national carrier that shows the flag everywhere. I think that flag idea somehow will have to give priority to sustainability, to profitability, to commercialization of their organization. If they are only pumping money into airline because it carries the flag of a country, I think they will not get anywhere. At some point, they will give up.
Yeah, and I think that's starting to happen because of obviously the price of commodities. That was offsetting often the debts and keeping these airlines afloat. So now that doesn't exist, the safety net has gone, you have to operate it. And that's why people look at Ethiopian, because they come in and they say you have a private sector mindset to a public enterprise for the benefit, and you post profit. The African aviation industry made a loss of $800 million last year.
More than 50% of profit of African carrier comes from one airline, Ethiopian Airlines. The rest are making only 50% of the profit, and most make loss. And sustainability comes profitability. An airline cannot succeed without being profitable. And I think people will have to realize that.
Absolutely. So I could talk all day. I want to ask one more question, though, which is, we couldn't possibly have done this without, we've already alluded to it, without talking about the YD, the Yamoussoukro Declaration, decision, different guises. Next year, 2018, will be 30 years since the declaration was signed in 1988.
40 years, actually.
Is it 40?
89, the declaration, 99, decision.
Okay. So obviously, this is aiming at full liberalization of civil aviation in Africa, and we alluded to it. When that happens, there'll be one flag and smaller flags, etc. Now, we're 20, however many years on, and the decision is obviously unratified by a lot of the signatory countries. So I just want to ask you, as a finishing, we talk about this a lot, but why do you think it's stalling? And do you think it will eventually happen, or should we be looking at this on a regional basis rather than a Pan-African basis?
Actually, Open Skies should have started last July. And I remember in 2016, there was a meeting in Addis, sponsored by African Union. And at that time, they agreed that Africa will be open by July 2017. I participated in that meeting. Maybe some of you also participated in that meeting. The responsibility of creating that was given to AFCAC. AFCAC, its head office is in Dakar. And in any case, the governments are represented by AU, African Union. So AFCAC sitting in Dakar, AU sitting in Addis, they were to correspond, and by January 2017, when the African Union heads of states meet, they were going to ratify that. I suggested in that, and the Ministry of Transport of Rwanda suggested to the governments, say, look, this thing has been delayed for too long. We need somebody in the African Union to really coordinate this, and directly reporting to Madam Zuma. Almost everybody agreed. Then AFCAC felt, this is taking away power from them. So they said, why do you create two organizations? AFCAC is there, we will do it. I said, AFCAC, you are sitting in Dakar. You send your documents to AU. AU is more bureaucratic than individual governments. Your paper will sit on tray 13 and you will never be able to see it. Therefore, you better have a coordinator there. Say, no, we'll do it ourselves. I said, okay, let us see. And 3-4 ministers pushed it, but AFCAC used their contacts with some of the ministers, and there was no coordinator. Now, I was talking to the lady who is in charge of AFCAC. Last January, when they could not present, I said, why couldn't you present it? She said, we sent all the documents to AU, but nothing happened. The documents are sitting there. I said, that is why I told you to have a coordinator. She said, at that time, I did not understand. I wish you explained it to me. Now it is pushed to 2018. I hope it will happen. AU is a very bureaucratic organization, more bureaucratic than the individual governments. I hope it will happen. If that does not happen, it is a blow for Africa. And I believe when that happens, I think there will be a lot of change in Africa. I'm sure the whole continent is not going to be free at the same time. Regionally, in West Africa, there isn't much limit. It's good, but there are no airlines, unfortunately. In East, it's working, but there is this stupid rivalry between airlines. In the South, it's working better. But gradually, I think, if we do what the Southern African region did in all the regions, gradually it will happen. Whether governments declare or certify Yamoussoukro or not, gradually it is going to happen.
And I think that is obviously for us to come together without that as a backdrop, without the problem, the issues of bilaterals and the visa restrictions, which we haven't even got into today, and be able to have free conversations like you can at these kind of events around the world, makes them more valuable.
And more African countries are opening up. Rwanda started it, Ghana followed. There are many African countries that are now opening they're opening back to other African countries to come freely to their country and get visa on arrival. It takes leadership, but it will happen.
We, as the industry, have to educate. We are the people. There are lots of representatives here. I think 11 countries are represented at Civil Aviation Authority level, and we need to go back and action this change and say, if this happens and we have this liberal environment, it's going to develop, it's going to help with the route development side of things.
I'm sure it will.
So the final thing I wanted to ask you was, what's the most important lesson you learned during your working life, just shortly?
You mean as a CEO or as an aviation person?
The thing you've carried through the whole...
There is one thing in aviation. Nothing works without good, qualified staff. You can buy all the airplanes you want. You can bring in as many IT facilities as you would want. If you don't have dedicated people, if you don't have people who believe in the mission and people who are committed to an organization's growth, nothing will work. So I think putting more emphasis on building capacity in aviation and trusting people to produce what they are supposed to produce and helping them attain that, I think is the most important lesson for me. And I think it helps a lot.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us. Just before we go, I do have one thing that I would like to present to you. We actually have an award from AviaDev recognizing your Lifetime Achievement Award for an outstanding contribution to route development in Africa.